Hi everyone, I'm Daniel, and now that the Hemlock Vale Investigator cards have been out for a week, it's time to do a deeper dive into some of the cards. This week, we'll be starting, where else, with the Masks of Hemlock Vale. Everyone has been talking about them ever since the Sparrow Mask was shown off last August, and now that we've seen one for each class, I'm so curious where popular opinion will fall on these now that we're starting to actually play with them in decks. Are they so strong that they should practically be an auto-include? Or are they just a nice cheap way to pass tests in a few decks, particularly those that are well suited for them? I'll give you my thoughts coming up, but first, if you're new to my channel, please like, comment, and subscribe. I'll be covering various topics about the Feast of Hemlock Vale Investigator cards and the campaign all this week, and I'll be thrilled to have you join me. Now, my channel does have a rules bent to it, and that's a good place to start. All 5 masks have some rules text in common that isn't immediately obvious on first glance. Let's just take a look at the wolf mask here as an example. First, all the masks are 1-cost items that don't take up a slot, but they also have the charm trait, which means that outside of the investigators that can normally take the cards class, 3 investigators can take any of the 5 masks, Amina Zidane, and 2 parallel investigators, Monterey Jack and Zoe Samaras. Next, they each have uses 2 offerings on them, meaning that they come into play with 2 offerings to use, and the text that you replenish one of these offerings after you meet some condition. What does replenish mean? The rules insert for the Feast of Hemlock Vale Investigator Expansion gives us the answer: when the condition to replenish an asset is met, place a specified number of uses on that asset, up to, but not more than, its uses X value. This means that there can never be more than 2 offerings on these masks, and you will want to try to use the offerings as much as possible if you think you might replenish them in the near future. Finally, each of the masks has the text "Limit 1 mask per investigator." What does this mean? The FAQ has the answer. While you can have more than 1 mask in your deck, you can only ever have 1 mask in play. On top of that, while there is 1 mask in play, you cannot put another one into play, even if it is a different title. This is different from slot restrictions. If your hand slots are full, you can still play a new hand slot item to discard one that is already in play. But mask is not a slot. If your mask has run out of offerings, you'll need to find a way to replenish it. You can't try to play another copy from your hand to give yourself a fresh copy. Of course, just like any other cards, they can leave play due to other effects like Crypt Chill. Alright, now that we've got the basics of the mask down, let's take a look at each of them individually, and I'll give you my thoughts. I have played with 3 of them through 4 different campaigns, and I've seen the other 2 played through full campaigns as well, so I'm eager to tell you about my experiences. First is the Guardian Mask, the Wolf Mask. +2 combat or +2 agility is very useful when dealing with enemies. Guess what? It replenishes after you engage an enemy. This is the most straightforwardly useful mask of them all. Guardians tend to have a lot of effects dealing with enemies, and the Wolf Mask helps you pass those tests to defeat them. While the combat boost will always be useful, don't sleep on the agility component either. Even though you can only use 1 offering per test, some Guardians will be very happy to evade every now and then, or get a skill boost on a tough treachery test. One more rules note: because the replenishment timing point is after you engage an enemy, you cannot replenish after becoming engaged with a massive enemy, as there is no timing point for massive enemy engagement. You are simply engaged with them. See also the discussion around Zoe and massive enemies. I've played this mask in Schizo Tool, who made great use of the mask from scenarios 1 through 8, using both the combat and agility boosts, and I played this in Wilson Richards, where it was quite good at the beginning of the campaign, and then towards the end felt a little bit less necessary. Next is the Seeker Mask, the Mouse Mask. The skill boosts this time are willpower and intellect, which are certainly useful throughout an entire scenario. However, its replenishment condition, after you reveal a location or put a new location into play, is much tougher than the other masks, especially if you do not put this into play early, or if someone else on the team scouts out those locations first. I saw this played in Kate Winthrop throughout a whole campaign, and was impressed. It is not unusual to double dip on a single location. That is, some effect may put a location into play unrevealed, which charges up the mask, and then you can move to it to reveal it, which gets you yet another offering. It's a good idea to make the owner of this mask the lead investigator. as it is often the lead investigator who is told to put locations into play from the set-aside area. Of course, there is one investigator that trivializes the whole thing, as he usually does. Luke Robinson has his dream gate that he can put into play at will, and indeed it leaves play at the end of the investigator phase, so Luke will always be able to add some more offerings to his mask. Now let's take a look at the Fox Mask, the quintessential rogue card, giving us boosts to intellect and agility. Outside of Tony Morgan and maybe Preston Fairmont, every rogue should be interested. The replenish condition this time is after you move out a location with an enemy. Because of the after trigger, this means you need to leave an enemy behind in a location. You can't simply drag an enemy along with you when you move. While you will need to plan out your turns with your other players strategically, the rogue card pool is full of cards that reward you for exactly this sort of behavior already. In particular, with higher player counts, this mask will be easier to replenish because of the higher probability someone is engaged with an enemy at the beginning of the investigator phase. Take your turn first to move, and you will be able to replenish the mask without much thought. I played this mask in Parallel Monterey Jack, and it was excellent for covering the -5s in the Forgotten Age, although towards the end of the campaign it did not replenish much and felt unnecessary most of the time. The Mystic Mask is the Cat Mask, and unlike its brethren, it replenishes both of its offerings every time you meet its condition, which is after Doom is placed on a card with no Doom. This is much more widely applicable than First Meets the Eye. Yes, it works when Amina plays an asset using her ability to put Doom on it, but it also triggers after Doom is placed on the agenda, a cultist, a location, or anyone else's card on the table. I don't think you need to play around with Doom to make this useful. Instead, I think about the skills that it boosts. If you're able to reliably use both willpower and combat, it's a fantastic addition. I'm glad to see the Mystic class pushed in that direction. If you'd rather use intellect, you might pass on this. Of course, every Mystic is likely to use willpower, so it won't be bad, but the card slot might be better used on something else to boost your intellect instead. Finally, there's the Sparrow Mask. The two skills it boosts are willpower and agility, which are the prime defensive stats, and it replenishes each time you take one or more damage and or horror. This is a little amusing because you can use those offerings to keep yourself from taking damage or horror from encounter cards like Rotting Remains and Grasping Hands. If you don't pass those tests, getting the offerings back is a nice consolation prize. If you can use those offerings for other effects, like Agnes or Patrice with spells, it's even better. Agnes, of course, is even sillier. She wants to take horror in the first place to trigger her damage ability. I played this one in Calvin Wright some time ago, and it's as wacky there as it is in Agnes. Toward the end of the campaign, though, it lost some value. It was easy to pass tests already. Was +2 really doing enough? On higher difficulties, the answer may be yes, but there is a diminishing rate of return on some of these cards, something I'll come back to later. Alright, you may have noticed that I left out something of the original conversation. There are actually two more masks in the box, and they are the neutral masks. It's really one card, Broken Diadem, which swaps with the Twilight Diadem once there are enough offerings on it. This card really has nothing to do with the other masks. It's a Bless Curse card instead, but since it is mass traded and has the limit 1 mask per investigator text on it, I thought I would briefly bring it up here. Good for those that really like extra Elder Sign effects and are willing to build around Bless and Curse. Otherwise, let's move on. While we're being completionists, the Hemlock Vale masks are not the first ones on the scene. These 4 masks came from the Carnivale of Horrors, a side scenario that you can play. As a reward, your investigator can choose one of these masks to carry on further into their campaign. Note that they too have the limit 1 mask text on them and also cost just 1 resource. Alrighty, the big discussion on these has been whether or not they are power creep in the game, giving us some of the strongest level 0 cards in their classes. Some folks have even already suggested tabooing them to cost 1 or 2 XP. Let's take a look at those arguments. First, these are items, which means they're extremely easy to find in your deck, and they only cost 1 resource, which means they cost almost nothing. And since they don't take up a slot, there's not much of an opportunity cost other than the slot in your deck. Well, compare these to the level 0 talents that came out in the core set. Here's Dig Deep, which, while also slotless and gives the same possibility of boosting willpower and agility, just like the Sparrow Mask, it costs 2 resources to play, and it won't even give you any boost to your skills until you sink more money into it. physical training is slightly different in that it boosts willpower and not agility, but these cards have always been mediocre or worse. Do the masks push them out completely? The talents do have some more flexibility in that you do not need to wait for them to replenish, and you can spend exactly as many resources as you want to for a test, unlike the masks that give you +2, but never any more. Maybe these talents aren't a great comparison. Let's look at higher education and streetwise, which boost the exact same skills the masks in those classes do. Now, higher education and streetwise are absolutely fantastic cards for their XP cost, and personally I think they deserve to be tabooed still, but the masks do to some extent feel like level 0 versions of those cards. Among the talents, the masks, and the composures, every class has a way of boosting every skill somewhat reliably, although I think mystics still can't boost agility. So maybe power creeping the level 0 talents isn't such a bad thing. They're not good cards to begin with, and only a few investigators actually have the money to burn on them. Maybe the masks are actually good for the game to have functional level 0 decks that reliably pass tests. The case has also been made that they're worth it in investigators who only have a base 3 or 4 in a skill, like Skids, to make those investigators playable, whereas someone like Mark Harrigan with a base 5 really does not need to waste deck space on the Wolf Mask. While I don't totally buy that, I think Wolf Mask and Mark means you don't need to, say, upgrade his weapons as early, I do think bringing the floor of some investigators up is ultimately good for the game, especially at level 0. I think Amina with her 3333 stat line is a prime example. She can take any of the masks, so her flexibility is now an asset over some investigators who get pigeonholed into some archetypes or roles. I'm also not convinced that everyone should run a mask in all decks going forward. I think a mix of other cards that give static boosts all the time and skill cards are good enough and are probably more consistent. In my experience with the masks, they definitely are not at full offerings all the time, and you cannot as a player rely on them because of this. The one experience so far to me that was an exception was Skids with the Wolf Mask, since I was only ever using the boosts for fighting or evading enemies, and then they were just replenishing. But even then, if the enemy was not defeated after 2 attacks, I was in a little bit of trouble. But that generally didn't happen later on in the campaign, which brings me to my last point. In my experience, the masks are much less useful later on. While at level 0, they certainly give you the equivalent of many unexpected courages, +2 to just some tests is just not good enough. It's certainly not bad, but you'll start to find those +2s or better in other places that give you more. In my Skids deck, it was Dirty Fighting. In Monterey Jack, it was Lola Santiago. For Calvin, it was Plucky. I admit that on higher difficulties, the redundancies are important, but while I find the masks to be quite strong and better than a lot of other options at level 0, I don't find them to be absurd looking at the card pool in general. Only time will tell how ubiquitous they become, but for now, I'm happy they're here. Alright, that is it for me today. What do you think? Which masks have you played with so far? Do you think they're super busted, or just plain old good? Tomorrow, I'll be giving you my thoughts on my first playthrough of the Hemlock Vale campaign, as spoiler-free as possible. Can't wait to talk to you then.